This recording is going to cover the functions of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is gray matter, and you see it's the gray matter located on the outside here, and that's going to be involved in all conscious behavior, things like initiating voluntary muscle movements, interpreting sensory information that you're aware of, but also we'll also talk about gray matter called that you find in here, and it's going to be gray matter referred to as the basal nuclei. So I'm going to do functions of the cerebral cortex, but also follow up with the basal nuclei. Now again, just to remind you, gray versus white matter. Gray matter is where we have the cell bodies. This is going to be integrating information, processing information. The white matter is the axons. It's the myelinated axons. It's going to be transmitting information to and from these areas, the gray matter. Now there are three functional areas. We're going to be looking at motor, we're going to be looking at sensory, but we'll also kind of look at referred to as integrative or association areas. So I want to start with the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. Now all the motor areas of the cerebral cortex are going to be located in that frontal lobe. The first area that we're going to look at is called the primary, and I'm just going to abbreviate it like this. That's primary motor cortex. That primary motor cortex is specifically located in where you see the red right here. It's specifically located in that precentral gyrus. So this convolution that's just anterior to the central sulcus, that's the location of the primary motor cortex. So when you want to initiate voluntary muscle movements, it originates in this region of the brain. And another area we have is called the premotor cortex. That's also located in the frontal lobe. So premotor cortex is actually a motor association area. Oop, kind of covered it up for you. So you'll see it located up here. So this is involved in learned motor skills like riding a bike, driving, that type of stuff. Another area that is in that frontal lobe that's involved in motor function is something called BROCA'S area, which controls motor speech. Now BROCA'S area is actually only located on one side of the brain. It's only in one cerebral hemisphere. Typically it's on the left, and so you see here in yellow, that's BROCA'S area. 90% of right-handed people, 70% of left-handed people, it's on the left side. Now the BROCA'S area is named after a French neurologist who back in the mid to late 1800s started and noticed people with damage to the left side had speech or language problems, and he had Broca had a patient called Leland Leborn, who they actually started to call him Tan because he had a very difficult time saying words, and he really typically would always say tan or usually say tan tan. And what they noticed after the man passed away, they performed an autopsy, and he had this syphilitic lesion in that area of the brain, and it affected his ability to speak. Now, that difficulty with expressing speech or even understanding speech is called aphasia with an S. Don't confuse it with aphasia, which is the inability or refusal to swallow. So people with Broca's aphasia have a loss of ability to express speech, and typically caused by brain damage such as a stroke. In this case of Leland Leborn, he had that syphilitic lesion. Now I will post a link to a recording with someone who has aphasia, and she has Broca's aphasia. And what you should do is, pause this, go and watch that, and then make some observations and see if you can answer these questions. Was Sarah aware that she had a problem? Did she understand what was being asked of her? what do you think of her ability to form sentences and words, and did she make sense to you? And then resume the recording. But if you want, you can just continue on. So I'm going to kind of go over some of the things that people with Broca's aphasia, they refer to as expressive or non-fluent aphasia. The people are very aware that they have a problem. They have very halting speech. They'll say a lot because they have a hard time actually producing the word. So it's a motor speech area. They typically lots of times can say a word, but they can't string them together. And often they kind of lack verbs, the action words. And they completely understand what's being, and they get very frustrated sometimes because they're like, oh, I can't say the word. So Sarah, who had a stroke, suffered damage to that Broca's area, so she had difficult time speaking, but she has since recovered quite a bit since the video that I show you, ability to speak, just a lot of speech therapy, a lot of work that she's had to do to kind of get back the ability to speak a little bit better. Now I want to kind of mention some sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So the sensory areas include, you'll notice there's a lot of different parts of the brain involved in sensory function. And the first one is called the primary somatic sensory cortex, or you can call it the primary somatosensory, all one word, but without the IC, SOMATO sensory cortex. That's specifically located right here. That is in the post-central gyrus of that parietal lobe. So it's the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. This is important in interpreting information, say tactile information, touch, vibrations, pressure, temperature, pain. So that's going to be interpreting that type of information. Now in the occipital lobe, we have the location of the primary visual cortex. So in the occipital lobe, you have the visual cortex. So interpreting information in regards to vision, you have photoreceptors in the eye. The information will be sent there for processing. The auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, and it's going to be getting information from our hearing receptors, which are called the organ of corti, which are found in your ear. Now the olfactory cortex, which you see here, it's involved in the sense of smell. That receives getting information from chemoreceptors that are located in your nose that detect odorants, and that information will be processed in the temporal lobe. And the olfactory cortex is also located in that temporal lobe. Now, last area is called the gustatory cortex. That interprets the sense of taste. So you have chemoreceptors located on your tongue, and also your epiglottis, believe it or not, that sense of taste. Now, the gustatory cortex is actually located in the insula, the anterior part of the insula, but also portions of the frontal lobe. So that's a kind of a weird thing with the frontal lobe having a little bit of a sensory part of it. So these are major sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. Now I kind of want to talk about a few integrative areas. So not sensory, not motor, kind of integrating things together. The first one is actually located in your frontal lobe, but way up here in the front. So that prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, which is located in that frontal lobe, is involved in your personality, determining consequences of your actions, right and wrong. The psychologist will use this as being like people determining good from bad. It's involved in executive function like social control. This is an area of the brain that has issues with people who are bipolar are schizophrenic or have ADHD. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This area is the last part of your brain to develop. Say it's usually going to be fully developed not till you're about 25 years of age. Now you want to think about it is you cannot get your insurance lowered until you're about 25. You can't rent a car till you're 25 because this part of the brain is involving determining consequence of your actions. So just think about why they do that. There is a story of this gentleman called Phineas Gage who had a steel rod impaled in this part of the brain, and he survived, but following it, they say his personality changed, because this is a very important part of controlling your personality. So it's kind of, a lot of people learn about this when they take psychology. Now another integrative area is called Wernicke's area, which is called the general interpretive area. This is located in kind of the junction with the parietal and temporal lobe. So it is the junction between pretty much the parietal and temporal lobe. But it is only located in one cerebral hemisphere. It's typically, again, like with Broca's area, on the left side. And there's a lot of communication between these two areas, between the Broca's area and the we call Wernicke's area. So with Wernicke's area, which again is on that typically left side, and it's between that parietal and temporal lobe. It's kind of the junction between the parietal and temporal lobe. A little bit more parietal than temporal, but actually, it's about both, I should say. Now, you can have aphasia with damage to Wernicke's area. Now, with Wernicke's aphasia, this is going to be a problem with comprehension of language. And I'll again post a link to a video with someone who has Wernicke's aphasia, and see if you can make some observations before you continue on with this recording. But again, if you want to continue on, you can. So this type of aphasia, they refer to as receptive fluent aphasia. They're going to sound fluent in some magical language. Unlike with Broca's area, they were non-fluent. Even though they could say certain words, they couldn't string them together, so they didn't sound like they're fluent. With these people, they're receptive, they're listening, whatever, but the thing is they don't quite understand, and they don't really not really aware that they have a problem. So awareness, not so much. They really don't really quite understand, I should say, they don't quite understand what's being asked of them, even though they don't understand that they don't understand what's being asked of them. They're not aware that they have a problem. They have problems with comprehension, their ability to form like words. They can form, and I'm using air quotes, kind of hard to, I'll just write air quotes, is the words that they make aren't real words often sometimes. And so they use the term word salad. So it's kind of nonsensical words. It's jargon. They do retain sentence structure, but the sentence lack meaning. And sometimes they put words together, and you're like, and they may actually been words, but you're like, what are they saying? I have no idea. And again, like I mentioned, they're not aware that they have a problem. So damage to Wernicke's area can cause Wernicke's aphasia, which is a receptive fluent aphasia. Now, the last area of the cerebrum, and specifically gray matter I want to talk about, is called the basal nuclei. Old school, they used to call them the basal ganglia, but then they had to switch that because it confused the term ganglia versus nuclei. So basal ganglia actually includes these areas here: caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. Now, these areas are very important in a number of different things, but this is at a subconscious level, out of your conscious awareness, because it's not up in that cerebral cortex. It does regulate body movements, but they're usually inhibitory, so it makes the movements more smooth. And I just want to think about, like, I want to go and reach for something. I don't want muscles that would oppose me reaching for something to work, so they would inhibit those. Makes that movement very smooth. It also, basal nuclei is involved in memory and learning and emotions, a lot of different things, but most things that you will notice right away is issues with the basal nuclei is these uncontrolled muscle movements in a condition called Huntington's disease. Is an autosomal dominant disorder in which if you inherit one defective allele from a parent, you will get the disease. And early on, it's changes in that caudate nucleus and the putamen, and you'll see all these involuntary muscle movements from these individuals. It's really hard to watch. And I won't even post a recording for it because it's really difficult to watch people with Huntington's disease. Remember, people with Parkinson's disease, the issue with them is people with Parkinson's, they have less dopamine that's produced from the substantia nigra, which is located in the midbrain. And what that dopamine produced by the substantia nigra does is it regulates the activity of the basal nuclei. And what happens is without the dopamine, the basal nuclei is more active. And so you have, with people with Huntington's disease, people with Parkinson's disease, they have increased muscle tone, they have a hard time initiating muscle movements, but that is a problem with dopamine produced by the midbrain, but it regulates the basal nuclei. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm just going to stop here.